All right, this is communication, CCSW Learn Communication. So let's begin with a definition. What is communication? Communication is the meaning making activity within a single person or between persons in various contexts and through multiple verbal and nonverbal channels. That may be a little bit hard to keep in our heads all at one time. So let's use a picture. This is what's called the Shannon Weaver communication model. It is generally considered one of the first models, that is to say, a visual representation of conceptual ideas, first launched by Claude Shannon when he was working for a telephone company, and then refined by Warren Weaver and promoted in a couple of different places. So the communication model that was original is this, right? There's a sender who sends a message, transmissions that. There's noise that interferes with that. It is sent through a channel, and then there's reception. The receiver experiences it and gives back feedback. Well, that's one way to visualize that, but uh, working from those basic terms and that basic approach, we can maybe think about it in a little bit more interactive and clearer sense. That's pictures of the guys, Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver. But the first thing we want to talk about is context. The context is the circumstances that surround the communication. Where does this communication take place, and how does this take place? So we can think about communication context in a lot of different ways, but four that I find helpful. One of those is to think about the psychosocial context. What's the relationship between the source and the receiver? What are the assumptions about what we're doing? There's a kind of think about the ways in which you have conversation, even face to face conversation, one on one conversation, but standing in a sanctuary versus standing in the parking lot. There's a reason we call those things parking lot conversations. It's not just about the physical context, it's also about the assumptions that we bring to that emotional, psychosocial, emotional context. But there is a logistical context, right? If we're doing a presentation in the sanctuary, we might have access to sound system and microphones. Whereas when we go to the fellowship hall, we may not have that equipment. The logistical context changes. Logistical context changes when we're teaching in a Sunday school room versus when we are at a community center for maybe a volunteer day. The logistical context shapes the nature of communication. We also think about interactional context, and I'll show a slide in just a minute that looks at that. But then we also have the mediated context. That is to say, how is media playing itself into this? Now, this can be something like the use of, for instance, the PowerPoint presentation in a communication presentation. It could mean the use of interactive ways of communicating. I've been to conferences, for instance, where the questions could be asked via Twitter, and they would come up on the screen, and the speaker would have to interact with those in the Q&A section. But all of that refers to, right, what kind of media is being used, what kind of technology is being used. When we talk about interactional communicate context, the interpersonal context is communication within oneself, interpersonal between two people. Not when we say relationship here, we're not just talking about friendship or romance, but also defining the relationship between, say, an employer and employee, or between an elder and someone in their flock. It could mean the relationship between the nonprofit director of an organization and stakeholders. But those one on one communications, while they will carry information, beams of persuasion, that they're about relationships. Small group communication, sets of persons who perceive themselves to be a group. So this could be a formal setting like the personnel committee or the board of your nonprofit, but it would also refer to people who perceive themselves to be a group. So the people who come and service the vans on Monday morning might call themselves the van crew. And that's not a name that anybody gave them formally. It's just the informal name that they've given themselves. But because they have a name, they perceive themselves to be a group, and group dynamics are going to be operating there. You might have people that come in on Tuesday and fold the newsletter and send it out and they might call themselves the Friends Bunch or whatever, or the Tuesday Morning Gang, whatever. But because they perceive themselves to be some sort of group, then those group interactive processes are going to be present. Presentational communication happens when you're preaching sermons or giving a board report, maybe even making a Sunday school lesson if the Sunday school is primarily lecture based. But there's a primary speaker who is the source, and primary audience who is the receivers, who are the receivers. And then we have mass media using mediated technology like television or radio or websites, blogs, to communicate to a large number of people, and that's fairly linear. And of course, in the last 20 years, we need to talk about this new thing called social media, which is sort of the overlap of mediated communication and interpersonal relationships and interpersonal communication. So look at it a little bit further. You've got a source, you've got receiver, and then you have channel. The channel has to do with what is the tool or the means of communication. Broadly, we say there are verbal forms of communication, which include speaking and writing, but also nonverbal forms of communication, which would mean symbols and the use of color and design. If we're talking about print media, it's voice inflection and facial movements and hand gestures. If you're talking about somebody speaking in a public speaking setting, it could be touch if it's an interpersonal communication, or the navigation of interpersonal space. All of that refers to channels of communication. But like I said, we think about channel maybe more discreetly. You've got speech, you've got conversation, you've got email, you've got the newsletter, you've got the website and Facebook. So, what channel of communication do you use most often in your ministry setting? Just make a list. Let's make a massive list of all of those ways that we communicate in our ministry setting. Okay. So you have a source, you have a receiver, it goes through a channel, and then you have the message. The message is actually what is communicated. Now, we might think that the message is simple, that the message sent is the message received, but that's really never the case. We have this process of formulating a message that we call encoding, and a process of um, decoding a message, that is interpreting that message that goes through decoding, and all of that is based on interpretation. A good example of that is if you write the word dog, or the letters dog, on a board, and you say to a group of people who will comply with you, um, what how would you draw this word? Um, on and you ask people to draw that, then uh, and at the end reveal kind of your picture of that, of those three letters, however you would do that. But you notice, right, even the people who took you kind of at face value and said, all right, I'm going to draw a picture of a dog, they might have very different dogs. Some of them might have big shaggy dogs, and others of them have very small dogs. Some of them might have very elaborate pictures of a dog, and others of them draw stick figure dogs. But no two dogs are going to look the same out of that picture. And somebody may have been, wise enough to know that what you said was draw these letters, and they would have drawn the letters D, O, and G. So we have these different ways of interpreting, and we know that the message is what is said, but the message is never completely encapsulated what was encoded by the speaker, and never completely what is decoded. Well, so what? What does any of this have to do with ministry? I think there's a couple of implications of this for ministry. One is that when we look at conversations, that communication uh, initiatives that break down, right? We can say, where did this break down? It gives us some tools to think about where to locate the problems that we find. Um, and we're going to do that in just a little bit with a problematic case study. And then the second thing, though, is I think it gives us a vocabulary for talking about how we plan initiatives. What do we do when we're thinking we've got to to move this into a new way, how do we think through that? And so we think about what's the message. We often spend a lot of time thinking about our messaging, but maybe not as much time as we should thinking about what channels do we need to use. Notice I said the word channels and not channel. What channels do we need to use? What are the possible ways that the message we send can be decoded by the different sources, receivers that experience that? And what kinds of noise might be interfering with the communication message that we have? So I'm going to use an example here. This is a case of Northwood, a completely fictitious nursing home. So none of this is rooted in an actual experience. So don't get uptight about that. But Claire and Jane are nursing managers at Northwood, and they recognize that their staffs, the staffs that they manage, don't just care for the residents of their nursing home; they also care for the families as well. And so they decided to launch a new initiative um, they call Family to Family. And this is the poster that they develop to launch that. So they say, Family to Family is an organizational cultural initiative designed to motivate the Northwood family to care for the families of Northwood. What they mean is when they say the Northwood family, they're talking about the paid staff of Northwood. And when they say the families of Northwood, they're talking about the patients' families. Um, but um, but they launch it with these posters. They get these posters printed, pretty posters printed, and they put them all up around the building. But just off the bat, what are you thinking? What kinds of reactions are you having to their initiative, their thought process, the way that they have framed the message? Yeah. All right. Well, as you might well imagine, it does not go as they had predicted. Adam, who is a program manager, he develops the activities for the residents at the nursing home. He assumes that what they're looking at doing here is creating connections between patients' families. So maybe kind of a support group or a mentoring program where one family that's had a resident in the nursing home a long time would take the new family under the wing and help them navigate the families. So doing things that would engage the different families. And he thinks it's a good idea, but he's worried it's going to create a lot more work for him. Tom, who is a bookkeeper, is pretty frustrated by this because he assumes that what this meant is that his family, his wife, his children would be expected to volunteer hours at Northwood. It's his family caring for the families of the Northwood patients. And then Manda, the CEO of the organization, was worried about staff burnout, and she thought this meant that the staff's families would get together and interact with each other, have some outings with one another. Okay. All right. So, what happened in that communication process? What do you see is the message? What was the maybe think about the channels? How did choice of channel affect this communication? What about what kind of channels might they have used to unfold this a little bit better? Um, yeah. What kinds of noise do you hear bubbling up in this communication situation? What kinds of choices might they have made differently to think a little bit differently about the noise that was being created? Do you have empathy for Claire and for Jane? That'd be a good question, right? You have empathy for them. All right, so that of course not a ministry setting, though I hope you can see some relationships. I chose not to talk about a ministry setting so that we could be a little bit objective about this, but I did want us to think about how often does this kind of thing happen for us. I would argue that if you can't find any empathy for Claire and Jane, it means you've not tried anything new, and that's on you, not on them. If you don't have empathy for Adam or Tom or Amanda, then you haven't been paying attention, because people miscommunicate like this all the time. But this helps us see, right, how the model can be grounded and used to analyze the deficiencies in communication and the problems that unfold. So stop there and take a second and catch our breath, and then we'll begin with the next section.